Hello friends, or maybe I should say greetings comrades, and take courage my fellow proletarians. I'm Thomas Waters and welcome to my video series on revolutions and the making of the modern world. This series is about the history of revolutions over the past 2.5 centuries. Today I'd like to offer an introductory analysis of the Russian revolutions of the early 20th century. That is to say, the revolutions of 1905, February 1917 and October 1917. Note that the months vary according to which calendar you're using. The topic is so vast that even introduction seems to overstate what I can do here. Think of all the local inflections that must have differentiated the experience of revolution in Russia, the world's largest country, comprising in its current form almost 11% of the Earth's landmass. And then of course we're not just dealing with Russia, but the domain of the much larger and more diverse Russian Empire, and later the USSR, the United Soviet Socialist Republics. Then there were the USSR's satellite states and client regimes, such as those in Eastern and Central Europe. And on top of this local and national diversity, you've got the various revolutionary situations, personalities, factions, conflicts and policies, all of which evolved over the course of the 20th century before the dissolution of the USSR in the late 1980s and early 1990s. What I can plausibly claim, by way of a big picture introduction, is that the Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917 was probably the most important event in the history of the 20th century. For proof, consider its major consequences. It established the Soviet Communist Empire, ruling 1/6 of the earth. That regime won history's largest war, World War II, and fought the Cold War. That regime also remade a peasant society into a nuclear superpower in just a generation between about 1917 and 49. That regime was, at least under Joseph Stalin, a uniquely powerful dictatorship. It inspired, supported and sustained communist revolutions in many other countries, including China, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Poland, Ethiopia, Yemen, Angola, Mongolia, Somalia, Mozambique, Albania, Romania, Yugoslavia, Cuba, and I could go on. The Soviet regime also created a totally new economy, society and culture based upon Marxism-Leninism. Further, it was responsible for up to 20 million excess deaths in the Soviet Union alone. Around 18 million people passed through the labour and prison camp system known as the Gulag. And let me illustrate the brutality of the Bolshevik regime through another fact. During the first 2 months of 1918, it executed more people in summary executions than the Tsarist regime had killed in legal prosecutions over the entire previous century. Some would object to me classifying the Bolshevik seizure of power in October 1917 as a revolution at all. At the time, it was described instead as a coup d'etat rather than a genuine popular revolution by opponents and critics like Rosa Luxemburg, the Polish-German communists, and the Jewish Labour Bund, which represented Yiddish workers in Central and Eastern Europe and in Russia. Many Russians today regard the events of October 1917 as a coup, as the historians of Russia like Robert Conquest. Other activists and philosophers, like Noam Chomsky, have called the Bolshevik seizure of power a counter-revolution, in the sense that it put an end to other revolutionary movements which had a more libertarian socialist or anarchist vision of human emancipation, as opposed to Lenin's focus on maximising production. I think there's some truth contained within these views. Ultimately though, I think the term coup d'etat is most apposite for those occasions when there's a violent change of personnel at the senior echelons of power. The Bolsheviks fundamentally changed and transformed far too much for their enterprise to be called a mere coup, despite its limited and provisional popular support. Likewise, their actions in power were far too radical to be called counter-revolutionary. In the end, following the phraseology of Lenin himself, I think we might say that the Bolsheviks enacted a repressive vanguard revolution rather than a genuinely popular one. After these very preliminary remarks about what the revolutions were and why they matter, I want to say a little about their causes. War, obviously, was one. More particularly, defeat or loss or the intolerable strain of war. That's one thing that 1905 and 1917 had in common. As you can see in the published extracts from Tsar Nicholas II's diary, what distinguished 1905 from 1917, what made Tsarism survive one but collapse during the other, was the military's changing attitude to the regime. The army supported the Tsar in 1905. In 1917, by contrast, the generals told him he had to go. Waning military support for a regime is a familiar revolutionary dynamic, which you can find across history. To take just one example, it was a critical factor in the eventual fall of the Shah of Iran early in 1979. Beyond war, the early 20th century was an incredible revolutionary moment, in some ways akin to the late 18th century age of revolutions. As the Princeton historian Stephen Kotkin notes in the first volume of his biography of Joseph Stalin, between 1905 and 1911 alone, revolutionary movements brought constitutional regimes to 1/4 of the world's people, though many of these regimes later failed. But though the early 20th century was a revolutionary time, the Russian Empire was a particularly productive fomenter of revolutionary attitudes. Why? Concessions to popular aspirations, whether the abolition of serfdom and the emancipation of the peasantry in 1861, or the creation of a state Duma in 1905, were insufficient. The onset of industrial capitalism in the empire from the late 19th century was particularly rapid, dislocating and brutal. The Tsarist regime dealt poorly with many of the key challenges it faced, notably the colossal famine of 1891. National and religious minorities were antagonized and suppressed by ill-conceived attempts to solidify the empire by Russifying it. Little wonder that numerous revolutionary movements sprang up across Eurasia. Notable examples were associated with what's been called revolutionary Yiddishland, the Pale of Settlement in Central and Eastern Europe, where perhaps 11 million Jewish people lived, often in appalling poverty. From this area came inspiring revolutionaries like Rosa Luxemburg and Leon Trotsky, as well as many working-class movements like that associated with the Jewish Bund, which played a pivotal role in the 1905 revolution, and which aimed not at the creation of a separate Jewish state in Palestine, but at universal human emancipation flowing from wider proletarian struggle. Still, it must be said that for all its inefficiencies, Tsarism was somewhat successful at curbing this upsurge in revolutionary activity. Membership of the Jewish Bund, for example, peaked in 1905 at more than 30,000 people, before going into a period of decline as its militants were more forcefully targeted by the regime. In sum then, the Russian revolutions of the early 20th century teach us that revolutions succeed not just because of the strength of revolutionary opposition. What's also necessary for a successful revolution is for the structures of power to first begin to collapse.